When I was 11, my family said I was a curse and left me on a doorstep with a backpack and silence. They vanished for 23 years. No birthdays, no graduations, no questions. Then one morning, they came back smiling, asking for help, acting like nothing happened, asking for help. I didn't answer right away, because what I knew then would change who was left standing when the door finally closed. Before I tell you how that moment ended, do me a small favor. Subscribe and comment where you're watching from, because stories like this travel further when people stay with them. What happened next changed who had the right to ask anything at all. I don't remember the exact date. Memory doesn't always preserve numbers when it's busy protecting you from what they mean. I just remember it was late fall, the kind where the cold doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in quietly and settles somewhere deep, long before you realize you're shaking. I was sitting on the living room floor, cross-legged, coloring inside the lines like I'd taught myself to do when voices started rising. I had learned early that stillness made you harder to notice, and being unnoticed felt safer than being in the way. Their arguing had become a background sound by then, something that hummed through the walls like an appliance you couldn't turn off. But that morning was different. The words weren't just loud. They were sharp, aimed. And then I heard my name, spoken like something sour. "She's a curse," my mother said, her voice tight with certainty. "Ever since she was born, everything's fallen apart." My father didn't argue. That's what made it worse. He agreed. "We were fine before," he said. "The job, the house, everything." Then she came, and 2 months later I was laid off. Then we lost the baby. It's not a coincidence. I didn't understand everything they were saying. I was 11, but I understood enough. I understood the tone people use when they're done pretending. I understood that my name had become shorthand for everything that hurt them. I stayed still. My crayon hovered above the paper. I didn't breathe until the argument moved away from the doorway. Later that afternoon, my mother called me into the hallway. She didn't yell. She didn't soften her voice either. She just said, "Go pack a bag." I thought we were visiting someone. That was the only explanation that made sense. I asked how long we'd be gone. She didn't answer. She turned back toward the kitchen like the question had been inconvenient. I packed what made sense to a child. My favorite jeans, a hoodie that was too big, underwear rolled tight to save space, and Penny, my stuffed rabbit, tucked into the corner of my backpack like a secret I was embarrassed to admit I still needed. The drive was silent. I counted turns. I watched leaves hit the windshield and slide away. When we stopped, it wasn't at a hotel or a friend's house. It was my grandparents' place. She didn't park. She stopped the car, engine running, and said, "Get out." I waited for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't one. I stepped out slowly, backpack heavy on my shoulders. The car door shut. The sound was final in a way no goodbye ever is. She drove away before I reached the porch. I rang the doorbell. My grandfather opened it just enough to look out. His face tightened when he saw me standing there alone. "What are you doing here?" he asked. I tried to answer. Nothing came out. He sighed and glanced down the street where my mother's car had already disappeared. "We can't go against your parents," he said, like it was a rule he'd memorized. He handed me a blanket, avoided my eyes, and closed the door. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the sun to lower. Long enough for the cold to start burning my fingers through the blanket. Long enough to understand that no one was coming back. That's when Mrs. Lenora saw me. She lived across the street. Older. Quiet. The kind of person who noticed things without making a show of it. She crossed the road quickly, took one look at me, and didn't ask a single question. She just opened her door and guided me inside like I'd always belonged there. Her house smelled like cinnamon and books. She made tea I didn't drink and gave me one of her husband's old sweaters. It swallowed me whole. She sat nearby while I curled into the couch, staring out the window at the house I used to think was mine. No lights came on. That night, something unhooked inside me. Not loudly. Just enough that I knew it was gone. The days that followed blurred together. Paperwork. Meetings with people who spoke gently and wrote notes. Mrs. Lenora became my guardian. Just like that. Not because she planned to be, but because someone had to be. I waited for my parents to call, to ask where I was, to check if I was safe. They didn't. Not when my birthday passed. Not when school pictures were taken. Not when I stood on stages with certificates in my hands and empty chairs behind me. I kept writing them letters anyway. That part is harder to admit. Cards for holidays. Notes about school. Updates I thought might matter. I slid them into the mailbox and told myself it was enough to try. One afternoon, Mrs. Lenora handed them back to me. Every envelope. Stamped and returned. "They don't live there anymore," she said gently. I lined them up on my bedroom floor that night, my handwriting staring back at me like proof of effort that had nowhere to land. That was when I stopped writing. Not because I was angry, because I finally understood. By the time I turned 10, silence had weight. It followed me through classrooms and assemblies and award ceremonies. Teachers stopped looking for my parents. The empty chair became expected. I learned to succeed quietly, to work behind the scenes, to never assume there would be applause. And I told myself that one day it wouldn't matter. I just didn't know yet how much it would. That was the beginning. Not the worst of it, just the part where I learned what it felt like to be erased slowly, carefully, by people who would later swear they never meant to hurt me. And at 11 years old, standing in a borrowed sweater in someone else's house, I had no idea that 23 years later, those same people would knock on my door asking for something they believed I owed them. That part came later, much later. And when it did, everything they thought they knew about me came apart. The years after that didn't explode into tragedy the way people expect abandonment to. They thinned instead. Life stretched out, quieter, smaller, edged with effort. Mrs. Lenora never pretended she could replace anyone. She didn't try to mother me in the way movies script it. She simply showed up every morning, made oatmeal the same way, asked what time school started, and waited in the car if it rained. Consistency became the loudest thing in my life. School was where the silence learned how to echo. At first, teachers searched the audience during assemblies when my name was called. They smiled politely, waiting for someone to stand. After a while, they stopped looking. By middle school, the empty chair behind me was expected. When forms asked for parent signatures, Mrs. Lenora signed carefully, always leaving space as if someone else might add their name later. No one ever did. I kept my grades perfect. Not because I loved school, but because it gave me something no one could take. Numbers don't abandon you. Deadlines don't decide you're inconvenient. Effort still counted, even when love didn't. I learned early how to be impressive without being visible. There was one more letter I wrote to my parents. I never mailed it. I wrote it after an academic award arrived in the mail, the kind that usually comes with a ceremony and clapping and photos. This one came alone, folded into a plain envelope. I wrote, "I got another one. I stopped expecting you, but I still wanted you to know." I walked it all the way to the mailbox, stood there for a long time, then tore it in half and dropped it in the trash. I remember whispering, "I get it now," not with bitterness, but relief. Understanding can be its own kind of freedom. When I was 15, Mrs. Lenora asked me to help her clean out an old cabinet in the kitchen. It was packed with years of paper, bills, recipes, things that mattered once and didn't anymore. Near the back, I found a thick envelope with my name written on it, not addressed, just labeled. Inside were bank statements and a short note in my grandmother's handwriting. "This is yours. I set it aside when you were born. You deserved something of your own." The first statement showed a savings account opened the year I was born. The last showed a balance of 0. The withdrawal date was 2 weeks after I was left on that doorstep. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Mrs. Lenora didn't speak. She sat beside me and placed a hand on my back, steady, grounded. I didn't ask questions. I already knew the answers. They hadn't just erased me emotionally. They'd made sure I had nothing to come back for. That was the moment anger finally arrived. Not explosive. Not loud. It settled in me like a plan. I started working that summer. A diner in the mornings. A gym at night. My clothes always smelled like cleaner or grease, but my hands stayed busy and that mattered. I saved every dollar. I read everything I could get my hands on. I spent afternoons at the public library because it didn't ask why you stayed so long. That's where the idea started. Not all at once. Just a question that wouldn't leave me alone. What happens to kids like me when no one shows up? Not in movies. Not in speeches. In real life. I started building something small. A digital board at first. Resources I wished I'd had. How to apply for scholarships without parents. How to rent an apartment without a cosigner. How to file taxes when no one ever taught you what a form meant. I didn't tell anyone about it. I worked quietly the way I'd learned to. The site went live with no announcement. I shared it once in a foster care forum under a username that didn't include my name. Someone commented, "This would have saved me years." That was enough. The project grew slowly. Then suddenly, by the time I graduated, it had traffic I didn't understand and emails I didn't expect. Teachers started asking questions. Administrators who once seated me in the back asked if I'd like to speak. I said no. I didn't want stages. I wanted systems. After graduation, the invitation came in the mail. Thin paper. No congratulations. Just logistics. Formal attire encouraged. Honors announced during the program. My name wasn't listed. Mrs. Lenora squeezed my arm when she noticed. "We can leave," she whispered. "No," I said. "We'll stay." They seated us at overflow. No tablecloth. No flowers. A paper sign taped to a folding table. During the ceremony, my name was skipped. Not mispronounced. Skipped. I didn't react. I stood up quietly and walked out before the applause started. That night, Mrs. Lenora slid a letter across the table. She'd already sent copies to the school. Just facts. No emotion. I declined their offer of a private recognition meeting days later. Some apologies come too late to be useful. The site grew faster after that. Articles followed. Interviews I almost declined. A small feature turned into a national one. My face appeared on a screen at the library one afternoon, and I closed the browser without smiling. That night, I left my phone face up on the counter. It didn't ring. I wasn't surprised, but something in me shifted anyway. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Then came the hospital. Mrs. Lenora slipped on the porch one morning. Nothing dramatic. An ankle that refused to cooperate. We spent hours under harsh lights and beige walls. I filled out forms while she pretended not to be in pain. That's when I heard my mother's voice. Soft. Comforting. Directed at someone else. She stood across the hallway with her hand on another woman's shoulder, offering reassurance I had never received. She looked up, met my eyes for half a second, then looked away like I was a stranger. She walked past me minutes later. Didn't pause. Didn't flinch. That was the moment I stopped needing closure. 3 days later, my sister texted me. "I saw you at the hospital." I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry." I replied, "Thanks." That was it. Some people mistake boundaries for cruelty. They confuse silence with punishment. But what I felt wasn't cold. It was clean. Weeks passed. Work expanded. The platform gained partners. Then, on a quiet Tuesday, an envelope arrived. Cream-colored. Legal letterhead. My parents, through an attorney, were requesting financial assistance. College tuition. Family continuity. They cited the years they had raised and supported me. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on my desk. The past wasn't done with me yet. But this time I was ready. And they had no idea what they'd just started. I didn't answer the letter right away. I didn't shred it either. I placed it in the center drawer of my desk, the one I used for things that needed time to reveal their shape. I had learned that reacting too fast was exactly what people like my parents expected. Silence unsettled them far more than refusal ever could. The next message didn't come from them directly. It came from someone who had always known how to deliver other people's intentions without owning them. My Uncle Gordon. The subject line was short, almost gentle. Family duty. There was no greeting. No question. Just a statement, dressed up like concern. He wrote about blood. About obligation. About how everyone makes sacrifices for family, whether they like it or not. He reminded me, casually, that I'd been given a chance in life. He implied that this was my moment to give back. I read it once. Then again. The language wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. The entitlement was baked into every sentence. I printed the email. I printed the lawyer's letter too. I placed them side by side on my desk and stared at them until something inside me clicked into place. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted access. That night, I sat on my balcony with a mug of tea growing cold in my hands. The city lights below hummed with movement and intention. Somewhere, people were finishing dinners, closing laptops, laughing with friends who knew their full names and histories. I used to think success would feel like applause. Now I knew better. Success felt like not needing permission. The next morning, I forwarded everything to my attorney. I didn't add commentary. I didn't ask for advice. I just wrote, "I want this documented." She replied within the hour. Good instinct. That was when the past decided it wasn't done whispering yet. A package arrived 2 days later. No return address. Just my name written in block letters I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a dusty VHS tape wrapped in a plastic grocery bag from a store that no longer existed. I stared at it for a long time before borrowing a converter from the tech team downstairs. When the footage loaded, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. It was me, 9 years old, standing on a porch, backpack slung over one shoulder, too big for my frame. The timestamp in the corner read a date I recognized instantly. The camera shook slightly as someone adjusted their grip. I heard my father's voice clearly. "You don't live here anymore." Then the sound of a car door, gravel crunching, tires pulling away. I didn't cry in the video. I just stood there blinking, like I was waiting for the rules to make sense. I had forgotten that someone might have seen it, that someone might have cared enough to record it. I sat through the footage twice. Then I closed my laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. That was the moment everything aligned. They hadn't just erased me privately. They had rewritten the story publicly. And they were counting on the fact that no one would ever challenge it with proof. I called Rachel that afternoon. She didn't interrupt while I explained. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You don't want to destroy them," she said carefully. "No," I replied. "I want the record to exist." We recorded my statement in one take. No music. No edits. Just me sitting in my office, speaking plainly. I said what happened. I said what didn't. I said what silence had cost me and what it had taught me. I didn't ask for sympathy. I didn't accuse. I documented. When I posted it, I didn't attach a caption beyond a single sentence. "If you want to know who I am, look here." The response wasn't immediate. Then it was everywhere. Messages poured in from people I'd never met. Stories eerily similar to mine. Children who'd been labeled problems. Teenagers pushed out quietly. Adults who had rebuilt themselves only to be told they still owed something to the people who broke them first. By the third day, the story had reached national outlets. Then came the follow-up email from my parents' attorney. "We are open to resolving this privately in the interest of preserving family dignity." I didn't respond. The dignity they were worried about had never included me. A week later, an invitation arrived. Cream paper, gold trim, formal font. My younger brother's birthday celebration. Venue listed. Formal attire encouraged. Signed with love. I understood immediately. They wanted me visible again. Not included. Displayed. I said yes. The night of the event, I arrived early. I wore a navy suit. Sharp lines. No softness. The check-in attendant glanced at my name, hesitated, then directed me toward the far end of the room. Overflow seating. A folding table near the emergency exit. No linens. No centerpiece. Just a card with the word overflow printed neatly in black ink. I sat down and poured myself water. My father took the microphone an hour later. He thanked everyone for supporting the family over the years. He spoke about loyalty, about standing together, about pride. He never said my name. I checked my phone under the table. A message from Rachel. They leaked your feature to the local paper. Article runs Monday. So that was it. I wasn't there as a daughter. I was there as proof. I stood up before dessert. No one stopped me. No one followed. On my way out, I picked up the overflow card and wrote on the back, "Thanks for the reminder." This table was never mine. I placed it on the plate and walked out. The next letter came with mediation terms. I agreed to attend. I brought my attorney. I wore a wire. The conference room was small, neutral. My parents sat across from me, composed, calm, dressed for reasonableness. They spoke about misunderstandings, about hard choices, about how success changes perspective. When they said, "We did raise you," something in the room shifted. Which part? I asked quietly. The doorstep or the silence that followed? They didn't answer. 3 weeks later, the court ruling was clear. I owed them nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I didn't stop. That night, I burned the original demand letter in a ceramic dish and watched it curl into ash. I wasn't winning. I was closing a door. I thought that would be the end. I was wrong, because the past always tries once more when it senses finality approaching. And this time it showed up in person, standing in the parking lot outside my office. My mother, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't afraid of her anymore. She didn't wave when she saw me. She didn't smile either. She just stood there between two parked cars, clutching her purse like it was the last thing anchoring her to the moment. For a split second, the image of her standing outside my office felt unreal, like my brain was still catching up to what my eyes already knew. I stopped walking. Not because she asked me to. She hadn't spoken yet. I stopped because I wanted to decide for myself how close I would allow the past to get. "You don't have to be afraid," she said, finally breaking the silence. The word landed wrong. Afraid. It assumed something that no longer existed. "I'm not," I replied. That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. She took a step forward, then hesitated, like she wasn't sure where the invisible line was anymore. "We didn't come here to argue," she said, then glanced over her shoulder. My father stood a few steps back, arms crossed, posture defensive. He didn't approach. He never did when things got uncomfortable. "You came here unannounced," I said. "That's already an argument." She winced just slightly. Then she shifted tactics. I recognized it instantly. The softened voice, the appeal to emotion, the carefully practiced tone that made her sound reasonable even when she wasn't. "We've been worried about you," she said. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand." I almost laughed. "Out of whose hands?" I asked. She ignored the question. "People are saying things, twisting stories. You know how the media is." "Yes," I said calmly. "They tend to prefer documentation." My father cleared his throat behind her. "We thought it would be better to talk privately." "You tried that," I said. "Through lawyers." "That was different," she insisted. "That was about money. And this is about what?" I asked. She hesitated too long. That was the answer. I stepped back, swiped my access card, and opened the office door. "I have a meeting," I said. "If you're finished, you should go." Her eyes widened. "That's it? After everything?" I turned and looked at her fully then. Not with anger. Not with sadness. With clarity. "After everything," I said. "This is exactly it." I didn't wait for a response. I went inside and let the door close behind me. Through the glass, I watched her stand there, frozen, as if she'd expected the moment to unfold differently, as if she thought showing up in person still carried weight. It didn't. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, the article ran. It wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. It was clean, factual, thorough. It laid out timelines, records, patterns. It didn't accuse. It let the truth do what it always does when it's given space, connect itself. By noon, my inbox was unusable. Messages poured in. Some supportive, some furious, some from extended relatives I hadn't heard from since childhood, suddenly eager to explain their silence. I didn't respond to most of them. One message stood out. From my brother. They didn't tell me everything. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I stared at it for a long time. Then I archived it. Not deleted. Archived. Some conversations don't end. They just get postponed until the other person is ready to be honest, without conditions. That afternoon, my attorney called. They're panicking, she said. Your parents' legal team reached out again. They want to talk settlement. There's nothing to settle, I replied. I know, she said. They don't. That was when I understood something important. This was never about money. Money was just the excuse they felt comfortable using. What they were really losing was control over the narrative, and they had no idea how to live without it. A week later, a formal apology arrived. Typed, polished, carefully worded. It acknowledged misunderstandings and difficult circumstances. It expressed regret if pain was caused. It asked delicately whether I would consider issuing a joint statement to quiet the situation. I read it once. Then I placed it in the same drawer as the original demand letter. Silence, I'd learned, was a language they finally understood. That didn't stop them from trying one last time. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later. A charity fundraiser. Their names still carried enough weight to host one, at least for now. My name was printed beneath theirs on the guest list. Not as a speaker, as a sponsor. They had used my public success to legitimize themselves again. That was the moment something inside me hardened into certainty. I didn't attend. Instead, I published a statement of my own. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was 3 paragraphs long and included dates, facts, and a single sentence at the end that said everything they were afraid of. I do not consent to my story being used to repair relationships I did not break. The fundraiser went on without me. So did the fallout. Within days, sponsors pulled out. Board members resigned quietly. People who had smiled beside my parents for years suddenly found reasons to be unavailable. The house they had built on silence began to creak. And still I felt nothing like triumph. What I felt was space. Space to think about what came next, now that the noise had finally died down. I spent more time with the platform I'd built. Read messages from kids who sounded like I once had. Quiet, careful, afraid to ask for too much. One message stopped me cold. My parents say I ruin everything. They say I'm bad luck. I'm 12. Is there something wrong with me? I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. And then I typed back. No, there is something wrong with people who need someone to blame. That was the moment the story shifted again. Not backward, forward. Because I finally understood that what happened to me wasn't just personal. It was systemic, repeated, passed down like a script no one questioned. And now, for the first time, I had the resources to interrupt it. That realization scared me more than my parents ever had. Because it meant I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was changing the rules. And once you do that, there's no going back to being invisible. The strangest thing about reclaiming your life is how quiet it becomes once the chaos stops chasing you. There were no dramatic confrontations after that. No shouting matches. No public meltdowns. Just a slow, visible unraveling on their side, and a steady, almost unsettling calm on mine. The platform grew faster than I expected. Not because of marketing or press, but because people recognized something familiar in the story. Messages poured in from teenagers sleeping on couches, from adults who'd been cut off emotionally but never knew how to name it, from parents who realized too late that silence could be just as violent as words. I didn't answer all of them. I couldn't, but I read every single one. At night, I sat on my balcony and scrolled until my eyes burned, letting their stories sit beside mine. Different details, same wound, being made to feel like existence itself was conditional. That was when I decided to expand. Not publicly, not with announcements. Quietly, I registered a nonprofit arm under the platform. Legal support, educational grants, emergency relocation resources for minors flagged by schools or counselors. I didn't attach my name to it at first. I didn't want it to become about me, but my parents noticed anyway. They always did when something slipped beyond their control. The first sign came through a mutual acquaintance, someone who used to attend the same community events, who now worked adjacent to the nonprofit world. "They're asking questions," she said cautiously, "about your funding, about your donors." I smiled. "They can ask," I said. "They just can't stop it." That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. A week later, my father sent an email directly. No lawyer this time. No greeting. Just one line. "You're hurting people who don't deserve this." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "You taught me that harm doesn't count if it's quiet." I blocked him immediately after. That was the day I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. But the past doesn't like to be ignored forever. It waits. It circles. It looks for cracks. Mine came through a voicemail. From my mother. Her voice was different. Not sharp. Not controlled. It sounded tired. Frayed. "We don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "We gave you life. We gave you everything we could." I closed my eyes as she spoke, because that sentence had always been the final card they played, as if creation entitled them to erasure. She continued, "People are treating us like villains, like monsters. That's not fair." Fair. The word sat heavy in my chest. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge specifics. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why I was making them uncomfortable. I deleted the message. Not because it didn't matter, because it said everything it needed to. A month later, the hearing happened. Not the one they wanted. The one they feared. The nonprofit was subpoenaed for records related to family abandonment cases. Mine was included as precedent, not as a victim statement, as a verified timeline. I sat in the courtroom and listened to my history read aloud by someone who had no emotional attachment to it. Dates, actions, financial withdrawals, educational neglect, documented abandonment. It sounded worse when stripped of excuses. My parents were present. They didn't look at me. They stared straight ahead, faces rigid, as if refusing eye contact could preserve dignity. When the judge asked if there was any dispute over the facts presented, their attorney hesitated. "No," he said, "there is not." That was it. No grand speech. No apology. Just confirmation. Afterward, reporters waited outside. I walked past them without stopping. Inside my chest, something loosened. Not triumph. Relief. That night, I dreamt of the doorstep. But this time, I didn't stand there waiting. I turned around and walked away. The final break came unexpectedly. My sister showed up at my office. No warning. No message. Just her standing at the reception desk, twisting her hands together like she used to when she was nervous as a kid. I didn't invite her in right away. I watched her through the glass. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone who had lived her life bending around other people's expectations and was finally realizing the cost. When I did step out, she flinched. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. I need to say something." I crossed my arms. Not defensively, just firmly. "Say it," I replied. She swallowed. I didn't stop them, she said. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop them. I nodded once. I know. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought if I stayed quiet it would blow over. That's what silence always thinks, I said. She took a shaky breath. They told me you were dangerous, that you were trying to ruin the family. I held her gaze. And now? I asked. She looked down. Now I think they were afraid you'd tell the truth. That was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from anyone in that family. I didn't forgive her. Not out loud. But I didn't shut the door either. Go home, I said gently. Figure out who you are without their version of you. She nodded and left without asking for more. That was the difference. They always wanted more. Weeks passed, then months. The noise faded. My parents stopped calling. The legal attempt ceased. Their world shrank as mine expanded. I spoke at conferences now. Not about trauma. About systems. About power dynamics. About what happens when narratives go unchallenged for generations. People listened. Not because I was loud. Because I was precise. One evening, as I locked up the office, I found an envelope slipped under the door. No return address. Inside was a photo. Me, at 11 years old, standing on the doorstep. The same image from the footage. On the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 4 words. You were never wrong. I sat on the floor and held it for a long time. Not crying, just breathing. Because for the first time, I wasn't holding the past to survive it. I was holding it to remind myself why I never needed their permission to move forward. And that was when I realized something else. They didn't lose me the day they left me on that doorstep. They lost me the moment they decided my silence was safer than my voice. And there was no way back from that. Not for them. Not ever. The absence settled in slowly, like dust after a room has been emptied. At first, I kept expecting something else to happen. Another letter, another demand, another attempt to bend the truth, just enough to slip back into my life. But nothing came, and that silence, unlike the ones before it, didn't ache. It clarified. I didn't realize how much energy I had spent bracing until I stopped needing to. The nonprofit grew into its own shape without resistance. Grants were approved. Counselors came on board. Partnerships formed quietly, efficiently. People didn't ask about my parents anymore. They asked about process policy reach. I was no longer an exception story. I was infrastructure. That mattered more than anything. One afternoon, while reviewing intake cases, I noticed a familiar pattern in the files. A girl, 11 years old, labeled disruptive. Behavioral referrals. Parent notes citing negative influence and bad energy. The language was different, but the intent was identical. I flagged the case for immediate review. 2 weeks later, she was placed with a temporary guardian. Safe, federal believed. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and stared at the city lights until midnight. Not because I was sad, because for the first time, I understood exactly what my life had been preparing me to do. Some people inherit houses. Some inherit money. I inherited a warning, and I finally knew how to use it. The email came late one evening, long after I'd stopped expecting it. From my father. No subject line, just a paragraph. He wrote that he didn't recognize me anymore, that I had become cold, calculated, that I had turned pain into punishment. He said family should be stronger than pride. I read it once, then again, and then I noticed what wasn't there. There was no acknowledgement of what they'd done, no apology, no ownership, just discomfort at the consequences. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my attorney and archived it. The next day, a former family friend called. Someone who used to bring casseroles when I was little. Someone who had watched me grow up, then watched me disappear. I should have done more, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. You should have. She didn't argue. That mattered. The holidays came and went without incident. No invitations. No surprise visits. No guilt wrapped in wrapping paper. I spent them with people who knew me only as I was now, not as the version they needed me to be. On New Year's Day, I deleted my parents' contact information from my phone. Not out of anger, out of completion. That spring, the platform crossed a milestone. 10,000 active users. Thousands more indirectly supported. We didn't celebrate with a party. We updated the website and kept working. But that night, I walked alone along the river and let myself feel it. Not pride, purpose. A month later, my sister sent another message. Short. I left. I stared at it longer than I expected to. Then I replied, I hope you're safe. She sent back a single word. I am. That was enough. I didn't ask where she was. I didn't offer help. Not because I wouldn't, but because this was her boundary to learn how to hold. I couldn't live her freedom for her. Summer arrived quietly. With it came invitations to speak, consult, advise. I turned most of them down. I didn't want to become a symbol. Symbols are easy to flatten. I wanted to remain exact. One afternoon, while cleaning out old files, I found the speech I'd written years ago for a graduation ceremony that never called my name. I read it once, smiled faintly, and then shredded it. I didn't need it anymore. My voice had found better rooms. The final message from my parents came unexpectedly. Not from them directly. From a legal office. They were dissolving certain shared accounts. Updating wills. Removing contingencies. Making it clear, formally, that I was no longer considered part of their estate. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny. Because they thought that was a loss. They sent it like a punishment. I received it like a receipt. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a single sentence. I don't belong to what abandoned me. Then I closed it. The past didn't follow me into sleep that night. It stayed where it belonged. Behind me. By the time autumn returned, I had stopped measuring my life in reactions. I didn't wake up wondering if someone from my past would resurface. Didn't brace myself when unfamiliar numbers appeared on my phone. Didn't feel that old instinct to justify my existence to anyone. The silence had finally become neutral. It no longer felt like a threat or a wound. It felt like space. Work filled that space with purpose. The nonprofit moved into a permanent office, modest but functional, with windows that let in honest light. No glass walls meant to impress. No oversized logos. Just rooms designed for listening, planning, and doing. On the first day we opened the doors, a teenager stood in the lobby, clutching a folder to her chest, like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. She looked at me and asked, "Is this really allowed? To ask for help like this?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "It always was." She nodded slowly, like she was committing the word to memory. Moments like that reminded me why I never regretted cutting ties the way I did. People assume separation is fueled by anger. They imagine screaming matches, slammed doors, dramatic exits. But the truth is, the most powerful separation is quiet. It denies the other side of performance. It refuses to participate in a story that was never told in good faith. That lesson followed me everywhere. I was invited to consult on policy discussions related to child welfare and financial abuse within families. I sat in rooms where people spoke in statistics and frameworks, and I translated those abstractions back into lived experience. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften. I described how erasure works, how it hides behind respectability, how it thrives when no one names it directly. Some people shifted uncomfortably when I spoke. That told me I was saying the right things. One afternoon, while preparing notes for a panel, I received an email from a journalist I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "I think your parents are selling the house." I didn't feel anything at first. Then curiosity nudged its way in. The house. The one with the porch. The doorstep. I clicked the article link she included. It was a short piece buried in the real estate section. No photos. No drama. Just a listing quietly noted, Price reduced, property vacated. I closed the tab. I had expected a reaction, some emotional echo, but all I felt was distance. Like hearing about a place you once lived in a long time ago, a place that no longer holds any claim over who you are. Still, that night I dreamed of it. Not the house itself, but the moment I left it. Only this time I was older, taller, standing at the door by choice, not force. And when I turned the handle, it opened inward. I woke up before stepping inside. Some doors don't need to be reopened to be resolved. The next message came from an unexpected direction. A legal advocacy group reached out requesting permission to reference my case, anonymously in a training module about coercive family dynamics. They weren't asking for my story as inspiration. They wanted it as precedent. I agreed, seeing my experience translated into safeguards, into language that could protect someone else before harm was normalized, felt like the most fitting closure I could imagine. It took what had been used against me and made it unusable as a weapon ever again. That's when I understood the difference between healing and erasing. Healing doesn't pretend the damage never happened. It makes sure it doesn't happen again. My sister reached out again in late October. This time she asked to meet. I didn't say yes immediately. I didn't say no either. I asked one question. What do you want from the meeting? Her reply came an hour later. Nothing. I just don't want to lie to myself anymore. We met in a quiet cafe halfway between our lives. Neutral ground. No shared history in the walls. She looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her, though still cautious, like someone learning how to stand without leaning on familiar structures. She didn't start with excuses. She didn't start with apologies either. She started with truth. They were afraid of you, she said softly. Not because you were difficult. Because you saw things. I nodded. I stayed because it was easier, she continued. And because I thought someone had to. I looked at her for a long moment before replying. No one had to, I said. They just convinced you that you did. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I just needed to say it out loud. That's where it starts, I replied. We didn't reconcile in the way stories like to pretend happens. There was no hugging, no promises, just a mutual understanding that the past could be named without being relived. When we parted, she looked lighter. So did I. Winter arrived again, but this time it didn't bring fear with it. On the anniversary of the day I'd been left on that doorstep, I took the afternoon off work. Not to mourn, to mark. I drove to a nearby town, walked through a quiet neighborhood, and stood in front of a house for sale that wasn't mine and never had been. I breathed in the cold air and let it sting my lungs. Then I turned around and left. That evening, I wrote a letter. Not to my parents. To myself. I wrote about what I had survived, yes, but more importantly about what I had built. About the people who had walked in when others closed doors. About the strength that came not from endurance, but from choice. I sealed the letter and placed it in my desk drawer. Some records are meant only for you. The final echo of my parents' presence came quietly, almost anticlimactically. A notice from my attorney. Estate updates finalized. No involvement required. No further correspondence expected. I forwarded it to an archive folder and closed my laptop. That was it. No confrontation. No grand ending. Just completion. As the year ended, I stood in the nonprofit office after hours, lights dimmed, listening to the hum of the building settling around me. On the wall hung a framed photo taken at our first community workshop. Dozens of faces, some smiling, some unsure, all present. I wasn't at the center of the image. I was off to the side listening. That felt right, because my story was never about being seen. It was about making sure no one else disappeared the way I almost did. And that was a legacy no one could take from me. Not ever. The strange thing about healing is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no clear morning where you wake up and realize the pain is gone. It happens quietly in fragments, in moments so ordinary you almost miss them. A laugh that comes without calculation. A decision made without fear of consequence. A memory that surfaces without dragging you under. By the time winter loosened its grip, my life had settled into a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Workdays were full, but not frantic. Meetings had agendas that actually mattered. People spoke honestly, disagreed openly, and didn't weaponize silence. I noticed how unfamiliar that once would have felt. Now it was simply normal. One afternoon, while reviewing a grant proposal, I paused mid-sentence and realized something startling. I hadn't thought about my parents in weeks. Not in the background. Not in reflex. Not even in resentment. They had finally lost their place in my internal weather. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt clean. The nonprofit crossed another milestone shortly after. We expanded into 3 additional states, partnering with school districts that had quietly struggled with difficult students for years. When we reframed those cases as children reacting to instability instead of causing it, everything shifted. Funding followed clarity. Support followed truth. At a training session in a small conference room, a guidance counselor raised her hand and said, "We always thought some kids were just broken." I didn't soften my response. "No," I said. "They were just blamed." The room went quiet, not awkwardly but thoughtfully. The kind of silence, the kind where people are recalibrating, is rare. I've learned to respect it. Later that night, I drove home through streets slick with melted snow, headlights reflecting off asphalt like 1,000 tiny mirrors. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. Not because I'd changed physically, because the tension was gone, the guardedness, the constant readiness to defend my existence. I looked settled. The past didn't vanish completely, of course. It never does. It just stopped demanding center stage. Every now and then, a memory would surface uninvited. The sound of gravel under tires. The weight of a backpack slipping off one shoulder. The smell of a stranger's living room where I'd learned what safety felt like for the first time. But those memories no longer define me. They informed me. One evening, I received an email from a woman I didn't know. Her message was long, carefully written, as if she'd revised it several times before hitting send. She wrote about her son, 12 years old, labeled a problem by teachers, blamed at home for every inconvenience, told repeatedly that he made things worse just by being there. "I read your story," she wrote, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't my son who needed fixing. It was us. I closed my laptop and sat very still. That was the impact I'd never anticipated. Not validation. Transformation. The ability for truth to travel outward and change something quietly, fundamentally. Spring came early that year. Trees bloomed before the calendar said they should, as if nature itself had decided waiting was unnecessary. On one of those early warm days, I took a walk during lunch and found myself standing outside a small bookstore I used to pass all the time without entering. Inside, the shelves were uneven, the floors creaked, and the air smelled like paper and dust and time. I wandered without purpose until a book caught my eye. The title wasn't dramatic, just a simple phrase about chosen family and resilience. I bought it without hesitation. At home that night, I curled up on the couch and read until midnight, not because I was searching for answers, but because I enjoyed the quiet companionship of words that didn't demand anything from me. That was another shift I hadn't expected. Joy no longer felt like something I had to earn. It was just allowed. The only unresolved thread remained my parents. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I knew eventually the world would bring them back into my awareness one last time. It always does. That moment came through a news alert. A brief local piece about an elderly couple seeking community assistance after financial difficulties. No names mentioned in the headline, but the details were unmistakable. Former homeowners. Limited support network. Estranged adult children. I read the article once. Then again. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel guilt either. I felt distance. The kind you feel when someone else's choices finally complete the arc they started long ago. For years, I had been the consequence they tried to avoid. Now, consequence had arrived without me. I didn't reach out. I didn't send help. Not because I was cruel, because I had learned the difference between compassion and self-erasure. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in months. You can acknowledge someone's suffering without volunteering yourself as the solution. I closed the book and slept deeply. A few weeks later, my sister sent another message. I heard about them, she wrote. I just wanted you to know. I replied after some thought. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. We were no longer bound by shared trauma, only by honesty. Summer approached with a sense of anticipation I'd never felt before. Not the anxious kind, the open kind, the kind that makes you curious about who you'll become next instead of worried about who you used to be. At a conference in another city, I was asked a question during the Q&A that stayed with me. A young man stood up and asked, "How do you stop wanting them to change?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth deserves space. You don't, I said finally. You outgrow the need. He nodded slowly, like someone setting something heavy down for the first time. That night, back in my hotel room, I stood by the window and watched the city move below me. Thousands of lives intersecting, diverging, rewriting themselves in ways no one could predict. I thought about the child I had been, the one who believed love was conditional, the one who thought silence meant safety. I wished I could tell her what I know now. That survival isn't the finish line. That thriving doesn't require permission. That family is not defined by who shares your blood, but by who honors your boundaries. And that the most powerful ending is not revenge, not confrontation, not even forgiveness. It's freedom. I turned off the light, lay down, and smiled into the dark. Because for the first time, the future felt like something I was allowed to want. And that knowledge was worth everything I'd lost to get here. The last chapter of my story didn't arrive with drama. It came disguised as an ordinary morning. Sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor in a way that made dust particles visible, drifting slowly unbothered. The kettle clicked off on its own. Outside, someone laughed, unaware of me, untouched by my history. I stood there holding a mug I hadn't realized I'd filled, and for the first time in my life, nothing inside me was braced for impact. That was how I knew it was over. Not the pain, not the memory, but the struggle for permission. I used to think survival was about enduring, about proving something to people who had already decided my value for me. Now I understood survival was just the beginning. The real work was choosing what came after, and who got access to it. The nonprofit held its annual gathering that afternoon. Not a gala. No speeches meant to impress donors. Just a room full of people who had once been told they didn't belong anywhere, now sitting comfortably in their own skin. Some had found housing. Some had enrolled in school. Some had simply learned how to say no without apologizing. I stood near the back, listening. I always did. A young woman approached me near the end. She looked nervous, clutching her phone like a shield. "I don't think you remember me," she said. "You helped me last year. I was the one who slept in my car." I remembered instantly. "You told me something I didn't understand at the time," she continued. "You said being chosen by yourself matters more than being chosen by family." She smiled then. Not the polite kind, the real kind. "I finally get it." I hugged her briefly, carefully, and let her go. That moment mattered more than any headline ever could. Later that evening, as the building emptied, I stayed behind to lock up. The lights hummed softly overhead. I paused at the door, keys in hand, and felt something settle inside me. Contentment. Not happiness in a loud sense. Not triumph. Contentment is quieter than that. It doesn't ask for witnesses. Driving home, my phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. "I hope you're well." I didn't need to ask who it was. I stared at the screen at a red light, considering all the versions of myself that once would have responded. The child who wanted to be seen. The teenager who wanted justice. The adult who wanted acknowledgement. Then I placed the phone face down. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Some doors close softly. Others never need to be opened again. That night, I pulled out the old journal, the one with the worn edges and ink stains from years ago. I flipped past pages filled with pain, confusion, questions that had no answers when I wrote them. I turned to a blank page, and I wrote. I wrote about the girl with the backpack, about the woman who stopped waiting, about the moment I learned that love without accountability isn't love at all. It's control wearing a familiar face. I didn't write about my parents much. They didn't belong in the final chapter. Instead, I wrote about the life I had built. The people I had chosen, the boundaries that protected me, the quiet mornings and steady evenings, the way my name felt solid in my mouth now, no longer borrowed or conditional. When I finished, I closed the journal and slid it back onto the shelf. Some stories are meant to be told once. Others are meant to be lived. Weeks passed, then months. The past stayed where it belonged behind me. Occasionally, someone would ask about forgiveness. About reconciliation, about whether I ever thought things might have turned out differently. I always answered the same way. Forgiveness isn't the same as access, I'd say. And peace doesn't require a reunion. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them well either. I simply wished myself forward. On the anniversary of the day I was left behind, I didn't mark it on a calendar. I didn't light a candle or revisit the street. I went to work. I laughed at lunch. I answered emails and planned futures. That was the truest ending I could give that story, because I was no longer defined by where I came from. I was defined by where I chose to go. And this time, no one could take that away from me. Not ever. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening. Before you go, take a moment to support stories like this. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Every voice adds weight to the truth, and sometimes that's how someone else finds the strength to open their own door.